It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains.
Post-World War II to the Civil Rights era. Things began to change in the wake of World War II. 4 factors flowing together ushered in these changes. They were the ghetto population explosion, the drug influx, the emergence of independent African nations, and the civil rights movement. The ghetto population explosion. Plentiful jobs during the war, coupled with a severe shortage of white workers, caused U.S. war industries to hire new Africans in droves. Southern new Africans poured north to fill these unheard-of job opportunities, and the already crowded ghetto populations mushroomed. Drug influx. New African soldiers fought during the war to preserve European democracies. They returned home eager to join the fight to make segregated America democratic too. But the U.S. had witnessed Marcus Garvey organize similar sentiments following World War I into one of the greatest black movements in the Western Hemisphere. This time, the U.S. was more prepared to contain the new and expected New African assertiveness. Their weapon was King Heroin. The U.S. employed the services of the Mafia during World War II to gather intelligence in Italy to defeat fascist Mussolini. Before World War II, Mussolini embarked on a major campaign against the Mafia, which enraged the group's leaders. Fascism was a big mafia, so it couldn't afford another mafia to exist. Mussolini's activities turned mafioso into vigorous anti-fascists, and the American government cooperated with the Mafia both in the United States and in Sicily. In the eyes of many Sicilians, the United States helped restore the Mafia's lost power. The Americans had to win the war, so they couldn't pay much attention to these things. They thought the Mafia could help them, and perhaps they did, said Leonard Shashin, perhaps the best-known living Sicilian novelist and student of the Mafia. During World War II, the Office of Strategic Service, OSS, the forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, helped to commute Lucky Luciano's sentence in federal prison and arrange for his repatriation to Sicily. Luciano was among the top dons in the Mafia syndicate and the leading organizer of prostitution and drug trafficking. The OSS knew that Luciano had excellent ties to the Sicilian Mafia and wanted the support of that organization for the Allied landing in Sicily in 1943. When Luciano left the U.S., numerous politicians and Mafia dons were together at the Brooklyn docks to wave him goodbye in what was the first of many occasions that international drug dealers were recruited by the U.S. government to advance its foreign policy interests. After the war, in return for services rendered, the U.S. looked the other way as the Mafia flooded the major U.S. ghettos with heroin. Within 6 years after World War II, due to the Mafia's marketing strategy, over 100,000 people were addicts, many of them black. The emergence of independent African nations. Africans from Africa, having fought to save European independence, returned to the African continent and began fighting for the independence of their own colonized nations. Rather than fight losing African colonial wars, most European nations opted to grant phased independence to their African colonies. The U.S. now faced the prospect of thousands of African diplomatic personnel, their staff and families, coming to the UN and wandering into a minefield of racial incidents, particularly on state visits to the rigidly segregated D.C. capital. That alone could push each newly emerging independent African nation into the socialist column. To counteract this possibility, the U.S. decided to desegregate. As a result, in May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court declared school segregation illegal. In its landmark Brown v. Board of Education case, which heralded the beginning of the end of official segregation in the United States, the Supreme Court had been made fully aware of the relations between America's domestic policies and her foreign policy interest by the federal government's amicus curiae, i.e., friend of the court brief, which read, "It is in the context of the present world struggle between freedom and tyranny that the problem of racial discrimination must be viewed, for discrimination against minority groups in the United States has an adverse effect upon our relations with other countries. Racial discrimination furnishes grist for the communist propaganda mills, and it raises doubts even among friendly nations as to the intensity of our devotion to the democratic faith." Malcolm X provides similar insight into the reasoning behind the U.S. decisions to desegregate. During his February 16, 1965 speech at Rochester, New York's Cornmill Methodist Church, he said, "From 1954 to 1964 can be easily looked upon as the era of the emerging African state. And as the African state emerged, what effect did it have on the black American? When he saw the black man on the African continent taking a stand, it made him become filled with the desire to also take a stand, just as the U.S. had to change their approach with our people on this continent. As they used tokenism on the African continent, they began to do the same thing with us here in the States. Tokenism. Every move they made was a token move. They came up with a Supreme Court desegregation decision that they haven't put into practice yet, not even in Rochester, much less in Mississippi." Origin of the Civil Rights Movement. On December 1, 1955, Miss Rosa Parks defied Montgomery, Alabama's bus segregation laws by refusing to give her seat to a white man. Her subsequent arrest and the ensuing mass bus boycott by the Montgomery New African community kicked off the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King Jr., a young college-educated Baptist minister, was chosen to coordinate and lead this boycott, primarily because he was a new arrival in town, intelligent, respected, and had not accumulated a list of grudge enemies as had the old guard. His selection for leadership catapulted him upon the stage of history. The 381-day boycott toppled Montgomery's bus segregation codes. Revered Joseph E. Lowry was part of a group of young activist ministers who had begun to test segregated public transportation laws in addition to Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Abernathy in Montgomery, Alabama, Fred Shuttlesworth in Birmingham, Alabama, Theodore T.J. Jemison in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Charles K. Steele in Tallahassee, Florida. The earliest boycotts were in Baton Rouge and Tallahassee, but they were unsuccessful, says Lowry. "We used to meet monthly in Montgomery to share our pain." After the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, the ministers met in New Orleans in February 1957 and formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conferences, SCLC, with Martin Luther, later nominated as chairman of the board. Months later, in 1957, Ghana became the first of a string of sub-Saharan African nations to be granted independence. As northern discrimination, bulging ghettos, and the drug influx were setting off a rise in new African numbers behind the walls, Southern segregation, the emergence of independent African nations, and the resulting civil rights movement provided those increasing numbers with the general political agenda: equality and anti-discrimination.